What if the crisis currently causing division and shaping our world isn't accidental? What if the problems we fear most, illegal immigration, identity theft, insecurity, were the very pretext needed to introduce something far more lasting? You may already be aware, but across the Commonwealth and Europe, governments are quietly rolling out digital ID systems that promise convenience but ultimately deliver control. And this is not science fiction, it's policy. And the pattern behind it is older than most of us realise. Welcome to the Luminary Room, your 15-minute illumination podcast. It's a space for those who question, reflect and seek truth. Let's dive into episode 2. Digital ID, the modern Panopticon. Okay, so you've probably heard the phrase problem, reaction, solution. It essentially describes a pattern where a government or influential institution, think big tech, introduces a crisis, provokes public anxiety or demand for action, and then offers a predetermined solution that expands control. It's not new, but it's subtle, and that's what makes it work. We're seeing the pattern unfold in real time across the Commonwealth, the EU and beyond. Governments are introducing digital IDs and biometric systems with extraordinary speed. Fingerprints, facial scans, mobile licenses, interoperable databases, all framed as convenient, efficient and secure. But let's pause for a moment. If we step back and look very carefully, a different picture starts to emerge. One that suggests these programs are not merely about modernisation, but about redefining how societies govern access, belonging and freedom. So, let's start with Europe. The EU's new entry and exit system is replacing passport stamps with biometric records for every non-EU traveller. Officials describe it as a tool to detect overstays and identity fraud. On paper, it sounds sensible. In practice, though, it means your movements are logged by default and stored in central databases accessible to multiple agencies. In the UK, a digital ID rollout was announced only last month. The government said it would help prevent illegal immigrants and illegal employment and speed up access to public services. But beneath the political gloss, there's something worth remembering. The program was architected by former Prime Minister and left-leaning advocate Tony Blair. The kicker though, the rollout program was promoted as being managed by a company owned by his son. So when power reproduces itself through policy, we should always pay attention and be ready to dive deeper into the rabbit hole. Australia is actually taking it a step further. Starting December 10, 2025, anyone under 16 will be locked out of platforms like Facebook, TikTok, Instagram and YouTube, unless they can prove their age. That means digital IDs and facial recognition just to scroll. Is this protection, or is it the beginning of a digital divide where access is a privilege, not a right? The country's digital ID legislation creates a pathway for public-private verification, where banks, telcos and government departments share a common identity layer. Officials, again, claim it will make life easier, more secure and more efficient. But it also gives private corporations access to the very key that unlocks your civic existence. Let me ask you, have you noticed how banks now suddenly ask why you want to withdraw your own money? It's not for convenience. They're watching, they're cataloguing and deciding who gets access. Canada, New Zealand and South Africa are all moving in the same direction. Each government frames its version as a matter of trust, convenience and progress. Yet each one expands the number of situations where your identity must be verified and where failure to comply means exclusion from normal life. And then there's India's Aadhaar program, a digital identity system now covering more than 1 billion people. It's praised for improving service delivery and reducing corruption, but also criticised for data breaches, wrongful exclusions and lack of accountability. The pattern is clear. Once introduced, these systems become indispensable. Opting out ceases to be an option. So, what's really happening here? Look closely at the sequence. A problem is amplified, let's say illegal immigration, identity fraud, or inefficiency. Media coverage fuels public concern. Then a technological solution appears, pre-packaged and ready to implement. The effect is not accidental, it's structural. When fear and frustration reach their peak, the solution feels like relief. And that's how the game is played. The late journalist Christopher Lash once wrote that modern citizens are educated to believe problems are solved by experts. That belief creates dependence. It also gives the ruling class, those who control institutions, policy and technology, the power to define what counts as a problem in the first place. If you control the definition, you control the outcome. From a psychological perspective, this sequence works because people respond viscerally to threats. When we feel unsafe, we become more willing to trade privacy for protection. We want quick solutions. We accept surveillance, not because we like it, but because it feels rational in the moment. Behavioural science has a term for this. It's called the foot in the door effect. Once people accept a small intrusion, larger ones follow naturally. Biometric checks for travel, normalised checks for work. Checks for work, normalised checks for welfare, for banking, for everything. In the words of one behavioural economist I spoke to recently, the convenience is the sugar coating. The control is the medicine you didn't know you swallowed. And don't be fooled, governments and corporations understand this. They've spent decades perfecting the language that turns intrusion into reassurance. You hear words like efficiency, inclusion, trust, innovation, but rarely words like oversight, consent, or reversal. The problem-reaction-solution cycle continues because it exploits both psychology and institutional design. And the incentives align perfectly. At the international level, policy networks like the WEF promote interoperable digital identity as digital public infrastructure. It sounds neutral, but it quietly locks countries into a shared framework where data moves easily across borders and control becomes both technical and political. Big vendors and system integrators, the ones who build and maintain these systems, secure multi-decade contracts worth billions. And once a state commits to one provider, switching becomes almost impossible. Lobbying, procurement rules and trusted partnerships clauses ensure the same players keep control of the architecture. Let me be clear, this isn't conjecture. Leaks and investigative reports have exposed questionable contracts in Europe and Africa, and the use of foreign contractors for sensitive border systems. So the question is not whether oversight exists, but whether it matters when decisions are made behind closed doors. Some might say these are just growing pains, that technology always evolves faster than regulation. But that's not the whole picture. When identity becomes infrastructure, power becomes invisible. Every checkpoint, every authentication, every data exchange reinforces dependence on the system. A system designed by people you'll never meet, governed by agreements you'll never see, and influenced by interests you'll never vote for. This doesn't require a grand conspiracy. It just requires alignment. Governments want efficiency. Big corporate wants profit. And the public, caught between fear and convenience, wants safety. That alignment of incentives is all that's needed for control to expand quietly without resistance. A privacy expert once told me, democracy isn't destroyed overnight. It erodes one login at a time. And she's right, because what begins as a voluntary choice, a digital ID for travel, for example, often becomes a prerequisite for participation. Without it, you're locked out of banking, healthcare, even voting. Choice turns into compliance. Yet, amid all this, civil society is not silent. NGOs and privacy advocates have documented exclusion, data leaks and abuse of biometric systems. And real-world breaches have already proven how fragile biometric systems really are. In 2019, Suprema's BioStar 2 platform, which is used by banks, police and corporations worldwide, leaked nearly 30 million fingerprint and facial records. Or Clearview AI, a company that scraped billions of faces from social media, had its own client list stolen. And only last month, September of 2025, they were found guilty of building a database of biometrical facial data. That's photos and unique biometric codes of Dutch citizens without a valid legal basis. Or let's talk about Microsoft quietly pulling its MS Celeb dataset after journalists revealed it contained millions of images of people who never consented to be there. These aren't hypotheticals. They're warnings of what happens when personal identity becomes data property. Academics continue to warn about design trade-offs between convenience and control, efficiency and equity. And leaked government documents have shown procurement irregularities that undermine the very trust these systems claim to build. So, we return to the essential questions. Who decides what counts as a problem worth solving? Who defines the acceptable level of inconvenience in the name of security? And when identity becomes the key to living, working and moving, who holds the keyring? There are ways to resist the drift. Public transparency, independent privacy audits, binding deletion rules, open source alternatives. They're not glamorous, but they matter. Procurement processes must be public, conflicts of interest punished, and oversight bodies given real power to halt programs that violate rights. If identity truly becomes the passport to civic and economic life, then the systems that manage it must be governed in sunlight, not in the back rooms of policy or the boardrooms of contractors. Because history shows what happens when power becomes opaque. And as citizens, it's our responsibility to ask questions before compliance becomes irreversible. Governments will continue to tell us that digital ID is the path to progress. But we must ask, progress for whom? And before you log off today, take a moment to think about how much of your life already depends on digital verification. Most smartphones unlock with Face ID. Your smart TV already recognises you. We scan ourselves every day without a second thought. Your identity, your money, your freedom to move or speak. All of it now sits behind a password, a biometric scan, or an algorithm you didn't design. What happens when the system makes a mistake? Or more importantly, when access becomes conditional on compliance? Let's not forget what took place in 2020. Who then decides who you are? You've been listening to the Luminary Room, your dedicated 15-minute illumination session. If this episode challenged you, unsettled you, or simply made you think, well, that's the point, because reflection is the beginning of awareness. Until next time, think critically, question deeply, but above all, don't accept the story at face value. This is 369 Lumineer, signing off.